The 70s saw some really wild television. It seemed like TV networks were willing to try anything at least once. From shows about space-age garbage men named Quark, Bionic Couples, or couples who are actually elements like the little-known BBC series Sapphire and Steel. Anything and everything was game for at least one season. Children's programming was even more bizarre, as networks tried to engage kids and teens alike in a time when psychedelic was the norm. When it came to a family and kids TV though, there was one duo who stood proud with a legacy that would dominate the 70s when it came to family programming and put the variety into the word variety show. That duo was Sid and Marty Krofft. They would be the creators of some of the most iconic TV series to come out of that decade. This would be the era that birthed projects like the Star Wars Holiday Special and several other that was a choice holiday-themed entertainment. The Kroffts, though, would let their imaginations fly and would go all out with the art and ideas wherever it took them. It was within this library of imagination that the Kroffts dived into the land of science fiction and fantasy. The viewers would find themselves lost in that land, along with a dad and his two kids who were just on a routine expedition. That's right, kids, grab hold of your life jackets and cuddle a slee stack, because in this episode of Gone But Not Forgotten, we're heading into the land of the lost. But we won't be totally lost, as we're going to be guided by not one, not two, but three of the stars of the series, as we're joined by Will and Holly. Yes, that's right, Wesley Ure and Kathy Coleman, and Chaka himself, Phil Paley, are here to give us an insight into the magical land. So let's dive over that waterfall and into the land of the lost. Kids and dinosaurs go hand in hand. I'm hard-pressed to think of a child from the ages of 5 to 500 who isn't at least a little bit fascinated by the giant monsters that used to tread the very ground we walk on. And it would seem that the Kroffts, along with Alan Froshko and David Gerald, felt the same way. The series would originally air on Saturday mornings on NBC starting in September of 1974. Land of the Lost was different from the other series helmed by the Kroffts, where many of their kid-centric entries such as Sigmund and the Sea Monsters, the Boogaloos, and of course, H.R. Pufnstuf were obviously kid-friendly. Land of the Lost went a bit different. The series followed the Marshall family. Rick, the dad, son Will, and daughter Holly are rafting when they fall over a massive waterfall during an earthquake. The fall brings them through a portal into another dimension, one where dinosaurs exist alongside strange, alien-like creatures named Sleestaks and ape-like humanoids known as Pacunis. The family must figure out a way to survive in this bizarre world filled with time travel and technology. Every week would be a new adventure in their quest to go home. But originally, things were going to be different. In this exclusive interview with Land of the Lost stars Wesley, Will Marshall Ure, and Kathy Holly Marshall Coleman, Ure gave us insight into the creations of the series.
Land of the Lost was going to be, thank goodness for sci-fi, and it was going to be like a Swiss Family Robinson, a boy and his dad in an exotic world, but it wasn't going to be science fiction. But it was David Gerald that came on board because Sid asked Gene Roddenberry to be the head writer. Roddenberry had just finished Star Trek the first 3 years on the Paramount lot. Sid said, I went up to him and said, hey, I've got this show. Can you write it? He goes, I'm busy. I can't write it. I can't do it right now, but I've got this young writer named David Gerald. And that's how David came on board. And thank goodness.
Land of the Lost was a pretty impressive show for the time, and pushed the envelope of a small budget by pulling off hybrid special effects, mixing blue screen, puppets, miniatures, and costumes.
But when the first episode didn't work, technically. What it was the dinosaurs were stop motion, and they were on film. We were videotape, and so they had to meld film with videotape. And so what would happen is they had the dinosaurs running in the Lost City, and Kathy and I and would be on it was a blue screen back then. It was chroma key blue, right. And not green screens. And they would shrink. They would play the video of the dinosaurs and shrink our bodies down to fit the size proportion, and then tell us like, look at that light up there. There's Grumpy's head. Run this way. Right. But the melding technically, and it was all done live. This wasn't in post or anything like that. It was all done, and it didn't work.
Well, also, we were disappearing. because from the waist down, I was wearing Levi blue corduroy. Wesley had a shirt on that was very similar to what I'm wearing today. And so he was disappearing from the waist up. I was disappearing from the waist down. So eventually they put him in a khaki colored shirt and I went to the maroon colored cords.
Yeah, it didn't work the first episode called Chaka. They were freaking out because without that, they didn't have a show. They called the Disney animators. They came over and it became this, within a week, all these technicians from all over the city in Hollywood got together and figured it out, and they were able to make it work. It was historic at the time. It was a technical advancement. And so from then on, we could actually watch, they would show us the animation and film of what the scene we were in with the dinosaurs or whatever. And then we'd watch ourselves get shrunk, and then they'd film it live, and that was it. We filmed every episode. We filmed 2 episodes a week. We did 1 episode in 2.5 days. So 2 episodes, 5 days. It had never been done before, but it was Saturday morning with a little budget. But it's the writers, it's the scripts that make it hold up, the creativity and the relationships. And it was a drama, like you were saying. It was, we lost our mom. The Sleestaks one time pretended they were our mom to try to kill us. Lure us in. I mean, this was heady stuff for kids.
And that saying that the truth is the loudest voice in the room. Yes, with hands down, the writing is what's kept it afloat over these years.
While the budget wasn't big, the crew used what they had in ingenious ways. There were only 3 Sleestak costumes, which would be multiplied by that camera trickery of applying the same image multiple times to make it appear like there were whole groups of them. The Sleestaks, in fact, lead back to that whole Star Trek connection, as David Gerald was the man who created the creatures in Land of the Lost, also created the breeding factories known as Tribbles for Star Trek. In another exclusive interview with Gone But Not Forgotten, Philip Paley, who played Chaka, the Pekuni ally to the Marshals, talked about the show's set.
We had 3, I think it was it was either 2 or 3 sound stages, and one was a complete artificial forest, complete with a pond. It had trees, plants, sand and different environments. And then another part of this stage, it was either the middle part or a second stage that was all the Sleestak caves, where we shot all the Sleestak footage. The other stage was the giant blue screen stage. It was a complicated endeavor for, like I said, a very limited budget. That whole one set that was all the jungle, we used different areas, backgrounds that were painted and stuff like that.
This wasn't the only trickery used during the series. Besides using the multiple Sleestak cameras superimposing, puppets were used to build dinosaurs. Both Grumpy the T-Rex and Dopey the Brontosaurus were created using puppets for their close-ups. For wide shots and fight scenes, the tried and true method of stop motion was used, just like in the old school Harryhausen classics from the 50s. This mix of special effects along with matting live action over scenes would create a pretty advanced experience for viewers. The cast for the show was headed by Spencer Milligan, who played Rick Marshall. Milligan had previously done a few films before being cast as the adult lead in the series. After 2 seasons, Milligan would leave the show when there was a long dispute with the showrunners over royalties over various merchandise being produced with his image. A big example of this was the sought-after lunchbox and thermos. These will run you a pretty penny on eBay today. Spencer Milligan didn't actually film Rick's final scene. Instead, there was a double with a curly wig matching the actor's hair. The method of his exit was that while investigating a way home, he accidentally swaps places with his brother Jack. As it happens, travel between the dimensions needs an equivalent on the other side to trade places with the one leaving the Land of the Lost. Enter Uncle Jack, played by Ron Harper. Harper was no stranger to bizarre versions of Earth, having previously starred in the TV series spin-off of Planet of the Apes as one of the astronauts who found themselves trapped on said planet. Jack would take on the adult protector role of Will and Holly for the final season of the series. And yes, the theme song had to be redone when Jack came on board. Casting the show has some interesting stories.
I met Sid Krofft. I got the job because I went to a pool party at Sid Krofft's house. I didn't know Sid. A friend of mine who became one of my best friends, but I just moved to LA and said, hey, I'm going over to Sid Krofft's house. We're going to hang out by the pool on Saturday. And I said, oh, okay, I'll go. And I walked in and Sid looks at me and goes, you. He says, I got a new show. Here's the phone number of the casting director. And Sid told me, and he just said in a podcast, he said, you walked in and they go, that's our guy. And that's why the guy who played Spencer Milligan looks so much like me, because they cast Spencer to look like my dad.
It started with my martial arts. I started when I was 4 years old. At the age of 9, I became the youngest black belt in U.S. history, and I studied with Chuck Norris. So when I got my black belt, there was a lot of news of the event, and then eventually an agent reached out to me or to my parents, was like, would Philip be interested in going out They asked me, and I said, sure. So first interview I went out for with this new agent, Mitzi McGregor. She sent me out for Sid and Marty Krofft production that was being developed. And they were just started casting, and it was for like a little monkey, kind of like half human, half ape type character. They gave me some lines. There was a full panel of NBC executives and Sid and Marty Krofft and the director. So it was like, I wasn't expecting like such a huge, like it was like a long table with a bunch of people in there. And as I was going in, Billy Barty was coming out. Billy Barty is a famous little person and was in a lot of Sid and Marty Krofft shows prior to Land of the Lost. So I was like, wow, I'm up against Billy Barty. That's how I got the part, was auditioning through the agent after I got my black belt.
I, on the other hand, had 7 callbacks. On like my 3rd or 4th interview, I walked in and Phil was there. And I said, Phil, because we were friends prior to Land of the Lost. We had worked together. We did a Cheez-Its commercial together that was airing at the time. And so I said, what are you doing here? And he goes, I'm auditioning for this show called Land of the Lost. I go, so am I. So it was kind of, fun that he was there and that he was going to be possibly on the show. But anyway, so during the course of those 7 callbacks that I went on, I met with like the heads of NBC, the producers, directors, what have you. But then they wanted to see the chemistry between the actors that they were looking at. And I never saw anybody else come in. Like I didn't see another father, brother, or anything like that. Every time I went, it was Wesley and Spencer. So they were pretty sure of who they wanted, and they just wanted to see how we would behave together. It was just instant comfortability, and we were relaxed, and just, it was like a no-brainer that we would be together.
One of the most popular characters was Chaka, the young Pakuni the Marshals rescue and eventually befriend. Surprisingly, he was developed with a shocking level of detail. Phil Paley told us a little bit about the portrayal of the movement of the character.
There were 3 of us who played Pakuni. Pakuni was the primate, / human that we were. There was also a language that went with this as well, which was developed by Victoria Fromkin, who was a UCLA linguistics professor at the time, and the Crofts reached out to her and had her develop a language. So she developed the Pakuni language.
She would create an entire 300-word dialect.
No! Ikaw may tea!
Chaka, Yeba!
Me wam! Ari!
Omowesa! Sa Efiede! Yeba Yumani!
Ikaw kuduchi!
Much like what would be created for Star Trek and the Klingons. Although this one would be a bit more easier for kids to learn to speak. Maybe not quite as forceful on the ears.
And the movement was based on the direction from the director. They also had us do Joe Jamalva and Sharon Baird and I. We had homework, so we had to go watch 2001: A Space Odyssey. So we kind of mimicked our movements and behavior based on the apes that were in that movie. We also had to go to the zoo and study monkeys and primates and how they moved. We all did that together too as well.
Through the series, the Marshall family and friends would run into various other characters and creatures who found themselves in the Land of the Lost as well. A couple of standouts were Enoch, the good Sleestack who thought he was from the future. The other Sleestacks were vicious and terrifying. In a surprising twist, it would be revealed that Enoch was actually from the past when the Sleestacks were evolved. The murderous ones that crossed paths with the Marshalls and Chaka were actually what the Sleestacks de-evolved into. much to Enoch's dismay. There were many pretty awesome creatures that would show up throughout the series' run, alongside the normal dangers of this world the Marshals had to call home. Medusa would appear in one episode. A very Bigfoot-looking creature named Kona would also appear. Another standout character was Ronnie, who is a beautiful blonde young woman who Holly meets and befriends her. Holly eventually figures out that Ronnie is a future version of herself. This is a really great twist that just shows how timey-wimey everything is in the Land of the Lost. Time is actually a big part of the show's mythology and storytelling, and it can actually go into some pretty dark places. As I said, Enoch will find out his advanced people would become the thug-like Sleestaks over time, not advancing but going backwards. The Marshals would come to the conclusion, or at least it's heavily implied, that they died when they fell down the waterfall. The series never pandered to the so-called kid audience, and that was because of the talent which was crafting and creating the story. Writers like Larry Niven, DC Fontana, and Ben Bova were writing the scripts and making a vast mythology. Some of the aspects of the show dealt with time travel, interdimensional voyages, advanced tech, dinosaurs, death, and simple family dynamics. They made a language, for God's sake. Remember Enoch? His first appearance was in an episode called The Stranger. The Stranger was written by Chekhov himself. Yes, Walter Koenig wrote this episode of Land of the Lost. The Star Trek has a strong connection to the show, and it wasn't just the writers. Michael Westmore, the man behind a lot of the makeup in Star Trek that Trekkies are familiar with, worked on the series as well. Land of the Lost would run for 3 seasons, but it wouldn't end truly. The story of the Marshall family actually never ended, as we discover that their plummet over the waterfall finds them in a time loop. So when they try to leave via the portal, they just wind up on the rafts again.
In fact, we used to have one around our cave. We're back at the pylon!
The series was a massive hit for NBC for a Saturday morning series. It would actually be run in syndication for a number of years and would be picked up by CBS for its Saturday morning roster. The Sci-Fi Channel would also air it during the heydays of the 90s, when the network first started. MeTV now shows the series as part of its classic TV lineups. In 1991, the Krofts remade the series with a different family named the Porters, who fall through a portal in their Jeep, not a raft. Actor Timothy Bottoms would play Father Tom with his son Kevin and daughter Annie. The series has more of a magical sheen to the Land of the Lost than the original series did. The series, of course, has dinosaurs and creatures, but also has an added female character. Krista was a teenage cave girl who has survived in the Land of the Lost after falling through a portal as a child like the Porters. Krista's costume is similar to a mix of Tarzan and Raquel Welch. The 90s Land of the Lost feels very, well, 90s. If you watched syndicated TV at the time and remember the beginnings of Power Rangers, Hercules, and Xena, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. While it was an interesting effort, the original series just had something you couldn't replicate here. While this may have had more budget and snazzier special effects, it just wasn't the same. The original series carried more in the way of the story and relied more on the mythology. Maybe it was the challenge of delivering something special every week without a lot of budget that made it stand out. The 1991 reboot would make it 2 seasons, 1 less than the original. Riding the wave of taking classic TV shows and making them into big budget film remakes was the 2009 feature film called Land of the Lost, starring Will Ferrell. The movie had a $100 million budget and managed to make about 60 of that back. Marshall, Will, and Holly in this are not related, nor are any of them teenagers or kids. Reviews were not kind to the film. It took pieces and characters from the original series and puts them into a slapstick-filled comedy, which cheapened it. So I guess that would answer to the question of whether it should be remade? Maybe, but I think that the people that made the film remake missed the point. While you can't recreate the original, it would be fascinating to see a return to the Land of the Lost that embraced the science fiction and fantastical aspects of the original. Land of the Lost, much like Star Trek, took the genre of science fiction, science fact, and fantasy, mixing them all with a healthy dose of human storytelling. As I said, the show never pandered to kids and never talked down to them. That approach is why it still holds up and is still being shown and finding fans to this day. The theories within the show actually feed into a number of speculations and discussions within communities like the one shown on Ancient Aliens and alien conspiracy websites. Time portals, time loops, and creature evolution like the ones within Land of the Lost are actually part of a lot of theories that you'll find online. As Spock would say,
fascinating.
The cast makes appearances at conventions all over the world, and everyone loves seeing them. It's also one of the only shows allowed into the official Star Trek convention in Las Vegas that's not actually Star Trek. Wesley, Kathy, and Phil will show up with their own raft and Sleestack heads in tow. You can even get a photo falling down a waterfall with them. I highly recommend it. It's these interactions with fans that still bring joy to the cast to this day.
We're grateful that fans still enjoy the show and come out to see us when we do Comic-Cons and stuff like that. It's a real kick, and it's amazing that the show brings so much happiness to people still, because they grew up with it, eating their cereal on Saturday mornings. It's so amazing when you're at a show, people are walking around, just kind of without a smile, or just kind of sullen, just walking around. Then all of a sudden they look and they see that we're there, and then all of a sudden they light up and get these huge smiles and are all happy to come see us. That's kind of a cool thing.
To our fans for supporting us over the years and being there through thick, thin, and otherwise. We have met some of the most incredible people, and keep in mind, some of these shows, 50,000 people come through. And we get a good chunk of those that pit stop at our table, and we get to interact and share their energy, which goes into us, and then we throw them ours, and it's a spinning cycle. They walk away laughing and smiling. We stay there laughing and smiling. It's a beautiful exchange.
Sadly, the show's not streaming anywhere, but at least you can buy the series on DVD. As for the 90s reboot, unless you get a bootleg at a con, you're never going to see it anywhere online. If you can see the show, I highly recommend you do. Just watch out for those pesky waterfalls.